Thank you for that warm and gracious introduction. I'll be looking for that genius guy when he arrives. Um, so this topic is going to be interesting. And as I was mulling over how do you actually present the case for is there a spiritual realm? So we're going to look over a few things. But this is our organization, Ratio Christi, and it's an apologetic organization. We work with high school students, university students, churches, and we come alongside and we want to try and train and equip people to understand why they believe what they believe. That in this day and age of, you can believe anything you want and that's fine, and we believe that truth is really important and that Christianity is true and there's good reasons to believe that it's true. And so that's a little bit of what we do. So is there a spiritual realm? The simple answer is yes. Any questions? Have another cup of coffee? So when we think of the spiritual realm or the supernatural, what immediately comes to mind? Ghosts? Don't be shy. Hey? The paranormal stuff? Demons? Tokolosh? Okay? Angels? God? Yeah, thank you. But in today's world, when we talk about the supernatural, that's exactly what we get. We think about these horror movies with ghosts and demons, or these TV series or movies, with werewolves and vampires and all the weird and wonderful stuff that goes on. Or maybe we think of like Ouija boards or seances or anything to do with the occult. That's usually what we think about when we think about the spiritual realm and the supernatural. But when we talk about the supernatural from a biblical point of view, we are talking about it as beyond nature, supernatural, beyond nature. And more specifically, the nature and actions of God. So when we refer to the supernatural, we're not referring to the occult stuff. We're referring to the actions and nature of God. And if there is a God, only God can said to be beyond nature because everything else has been created by him. Angels, demons, human beings. So only God can be beyond nature. So there are mainly two realms of reality, the creator and the creation. So to say something is supernatural is to say that it is beyond the creation. To say that an event is supernatural is to say that the cause of the event is a supernatural entity, which is God. And so we would maybe call that a miracle, for example. Now, one of the biggest problems we have when asking this question or when answering this question is that we are faced with a worldview or a philosophy of naturalism these days. And so naturalism is the belief that everything in the cosmos is a component or product of the physical stuff of nature. There is no such thing as supernatural, including souls, spirits, no God. Everything can or will eventually be explained by the hard sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, right? So that's the worldview we're dealing with a lot of the times when people ask this question. How do we know that God exists? How do we know that there's a spiritual realm? Some people deal with it from a naturalistic point of view. So they only things that you can see, that you can touch, that you can test in a laboratory or under a microscope. Those are the only things that are real. And when you think of how much science and technology has advanced and how much more we are able to explain these days than we were 100 years ago or 200 or 300, or imagine living in the first century AD. There's been so many incredible discoveries, and so people may think that God or gods are not needed anymore to explain the things that back in the day people would have explained. So things like natural phenomena like rain or drought or volcanic eruption or plague of locusts, thunder, whatever, were often attributed to some kind of deity, like Thor and, those kind of people. And during the 1700s, there was a very significant philosophical shift when people in Europe especially, that would change the landscape of our thinking, actually. And guys like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and who's heard of those guys? Some. But I promise you now that their philosophies have influenced every single one of us in some way or another, whether you've heard of them or not. And so these guys had a huge impact on people's understanding of reality, and especially on the existence of God. And so Hume, he asserted that the arguments for God are actually quite weak, that the arguments that people use for the existence of God, that they have been using for years and years, are actually quite weak. Because since we cannot experience God with our five senses, we cannot see, we cannot touch, we cannot taste, we cannot smell God, that he thinks that the claim that God exists cannot be taken as an item of knowledge. So we cannot know it because we cannot experience it with our five senses. And Kant asserted that human knowledge is limited to what can be experienced with the five senses. And since God cannot be experienced, we cannot know he exists. Okay, so these two major philosophers in the 1700s played a huge role in this whole thing of naturalism. And out of this kind of philosophy came theological liberalism, where everything started to be questioned. So the Bible's integrity started to be questioned, and everything that was supernatural kind of was reasoned away. So they would take out the virgin birth. They would take out Jesus and his miracles. They would take out his atoning death and his resurrection. And the supernatural was stripped altogether from Christianity. And in actual fact, there's a huge debate going on within the NG church at the moment between the guys who support the liberal side and the guys who are more conservative. And they want their schools to go back to teaching the truth of Christianity and not explaining the supernatural away. And so the problem with this is that there are things that people who prescribe to the naturalism view would probably know as real, but couldn't experience with their five senses. So would you agree that there are things that we can know that are not necessarily experienced with our five senses? What are some of those things? Love, exactly. How would you experience that? How would you put that in a test tube? And what else? Consciousness is a big one. Numbers. Mathematics is a huge one. Mathematics. I mean, the scientists would use mathematics, but yet by their own philosophy, they can't know whether it's real or not. Because how do you touch numbers? How do you smell numbers? How do you, obviously if you write it, you can see it, but the concept is, it's not grasped with the five senses. Anything else? Truth and morality. Okay, so I'm gonna go through a few of these things, and then we'll discuss one more item, and then we'll see how we end off. So let's take morality, for example. Okay. Now, I know that there's a big push these days for relativism, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we go into truth. But what is interesting is that whether people want to admit it or not, there is such a thing as objective morality. And I don't know if you know where this picture is taken. Nuremberg trials, right? So after World War II, when the Allies won and they put the Nazis on trial, they had a problem because they couldn't try the Nazis under German law because what they did was lawful. But they also couldn't try the Nazis under anyone else's, Britain's law or America's law or whatever, because they weren't citizens of that country. So they wouldn't be able to try them. So what did they do? They tried them against crimes of humanity. So they came to the realization that what these people did was crimes against humanity, which points to objective morality. And when you think of all the atrocities that have happened in our history, you think of the Rwanda genocide, there are not many people who would say that that was not wrong, if any. And in fact, I heard the other day, I don't know how true this is, but apparently Clinton, was he the president of America at that time? I'm not sure. Bill Clinton said that one of the things that he regrets in his presidency was the fact that he did not help the Rwandan people. Which again points to something that inside of each of us says that what they did was wrong. So there is some kind of standard of morality. The other thing that we can know that is real, but we cannot use with our five senses, is the laws of logic. Okay, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity. I just want to briefly go through these things. And, you may say that this is incredibly obvious, but all of this stuff is being challenged these days. Okay, so the law of non-contradiction is a thing cannot be A and non-A at the same time in the same place. Okay, so this cannot be a Bible and a cup of coffee at the same time right here, right now. Okay. To just express this, there was this Muslim philosopher in the 900s, and he said this, he says, those who deny a first principle should be beaten and burnt until they admit that to be beaten is not the same as to not be beaten, and to be burnt is not the same as to be burnt, not to be burnt. Okay. Now, we laugh at this because we know that this is true. We know that this is how it works. And, people who try and come around this have to still use these laws to explain why they don't believe in these laws. So it's almost like a circular thing. Then the law of excluded middle is a thing either exists or it does not exist. Statement is either true or false. Okay, and again, this is how we live our lives. Every day we make decisions or we do things based on these things, or we would hope we do. But actually, if we don't, then what do we say? That that person has no common sense, right? And then the law of identity, if a thing is A, then it is A. If it exists, then it exists. If it's a statement is true, then it's true. Okay. Which then brings us to truth in and of itself. And I realize, as I said earlier, that there's this big push for relativism in our postmodern world. And relativism means that our knowledge about a particular thing is different for different people. So us sitting in South Africa could have a different knowledge of the sun than, say, someone sitting in Tibet or whatever. That's basically what they're saying. So there's no objective truth. But if there's no objective truth, how do you actually live your life? And I remember we were chatting with some students and we were talking about this, and I said, well, just think about crossing a road, right? You and your friend are crossing a road, and a bus is coming, and your friend says, don't cross now, there's a bus coming. And he turns around and he said, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me, and he walks across the road. What do you think is going to happen? Reality is going to hit him very hard, right? Okay. So it seems that, especially when we talk about the spiritual things, religion things, there is no objective truth. You cannot say that Jesus is the only way. I mean, that's just, maybe that's your truth, but that's not my truth. That's, you can't force that onto someone else. And so in this postmodern, post-truth society, it seems that facts and truth matter less than opinions and feelings. Now, who of you have Twitter here? No one. Wow. You're not. Okay. So this analogy is going to crash and burn, but anyway. So if you ever happen to read on Twitter and you read just someone's post and then you read all the comments, it is just fueled with emotion and has no bearing. We can't dialogue anymore. Because as soon as I disagree with you, it means I hate you and I'm an intolerant person and so should be removed from society or should be cancelled from society, which ironically is quite intolerant, isn't it? So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that the best understanding for truth is when a statement or a belief matches up with reality. And in philosophy, it's called the correspondence theory of truth. So when a statement or a belief corresponds with reality, when it matches up with the reality. And as I said, this is how we live our lives. If we have two students writing an exam on the same day, and one believes that and it's the same exam on the same day, one believes it's at 9 in the morning and one believes it's at 1 in the afternoon, and they both live their days according to that belief, but the one who gets there at 9 gets to write the exam, and the one who gets there at 1 realizes they've got the time wrong. And do you think that the harder they believed in their heart that it was at 1 o'clock, it would have changed the time of the exam? No. So their truth that the exam was at 1 o'clock did not correspond with reality and was therefore false. So take another example, like it is raining outside, okay? It would be true if it was actually raining outside. So if we walked outside or we looked outside and we said, oh, it's raining, okay, cool. I said a true statement. Okay, then, so that's your theory of truth. But how do we come to know truth? And this is where we can use tests for truth. We can test for truth. Now, what are tests for truth? I would say that there are many different tests for truth depending on the kind of thing that you want to determine what is true or what is not. So, for example, a mathematical statement will have to have the methods and tools that would be able to determine whether that mathematical formula or statement was true or not. And the same with a historical statement. So if I wanted to determine whether Julius Caesar was assassinated or not, I couldn't whip out my calculator and punch in a few digits and a formula and whatever, and then, oh, okay, yeah, no, x equals y plus z, yeah, no, he was assassinated. The questions of history would be, you would use different tools or different tests to determine whether that was true or not. And the same would be for everything. So in many cases, the test of truth will depend on the kind of thing that which the statement is made. So reality is made up of a whole lot of different things: maths, physics, history, philosophy, spiritual, theology, others. I'm sure there's many others. And whatever we are trying to test truth for, we need to use that aspect of reality, the tools and analysis of that aspect of reality. So questions of mathematics require the methods of inquiry and tools of analysis appropriate to a mathematic aspects of reality. The same for natural science. They also have a specific set of tools of analysis that would determine whether that's true or not. And questions of history require different tools than science would. And here is where people make two mistakes in dealing with the tests for truth. The first one is that they take the tools for one aspect of reality and they improperly use them for another aspect. So I gave you the example of using a maths formula to decide a history statement. But the bigger mistake is to take the tools for one aspect of reality and improperly use them to reality as a whole. And that's what naturalism does. That's what scientism, and that's when people say that only what we can prove scientifically is real, right? That's what they're doing. They're saying, well, unless you can put it in a test tube or unless you can test it scientifically, then it's not real. So therefore, we can't believe in things like God because it's not real. But the question is, if you take that statement itself, how do you scientifically prove that statement? How do you put that in a test tube? How do you do a litmus test for that statement in and of itself? So if we get back to how do we know if the spiritual realm is real or the supernatural exists, we need to look at the truth of Christianity. And a couple of weeks ago, Reitzer went through the big 5 reasons to believe that God exists. And can you remember what they were? Test time. Dun, dun, dun. No cheating. The resurrection, that's an easy one. Come on. Cosmology, physics, the design in physics, design in biology, morality, and the resurrection. Okay. So there are 5 reasons to believe that God exists. And for me, the most incredible piece of evidence, and maybe it's because I'm not a scientist, is the resurrection. And for me, everything hangs on the resurrection. If the resurrection happened, it changes everything. If it didn't happen, it also changes everything. And I believe you guys worked through 1 Corinthians 15 last week. And in that chapter, there are 2 incredibly significant passages. The first one is that early church creed from verse 3 to about verse 7, where Paul is reciting what he had learned from, they think maybe Peter in Jerusalem when he became a Christian, telling people that this is why they should believe, that there are witnesses to this, that over 100 people saw Jesus alive. Not only 100 people that loved him and followed him, but also hostile witnesses. James, his brother, who thought he was out of his mind, then changed his mind and gave up his life for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Paul, a guy who was going around persecuting people, like literally wanting to kill the Christians, suddenly had a change of heart and became one of the most significant Christians of all time, possibly. I mean, what explains that behavior? What explains the fact that those early disciples changed from this cowardly group of people to a confident group who went out and proclaimed that Jesus is alive in the same city that he was killed? They didn't go 2,000 kilometers away where no one would even know who Jesus was. But in the same city, what would have had that change? And if Jesus really rose from the dead, it means it is who he said he is, the Son of God. And if he is the Son of God, obviously God exists. and he also speaks about the spiritual realm. So if he did rise from the dead, then he affirmed the spiritual realm. And the last thing I want to look at in regards to this question is near-death experiences. Now, there may be mixed reactions about this. I was also very like, oh, I don't know about this when I was doing some research on this. And I think it's because there are just so many different testimonies out there, so many books, that have written. I think one of the more famous ones is Heaven is for Real. I haven't actually read it, but apparently it's a movie as well, about a boy going to heaven and recounts his story and whatever. Some of these experiences can be dismissed, okay? They can be dismissed. But some of them are accompanied by evidence that actually can't be explained away. Okay, so I just want to look briefly at this. So when I was doing some reading around this, I came across this account of a neurologist's near-death experience. Okay, now he was a naturalist. He didn't believe that there was anything outside of this world except for what you see around you, the physical, right? But he contracted bacterial meningitis, and that shut down his cerebral cortex. So there was no higher order brain activity during the time he was monitored in hospital. He says that he was beyond a vegetative state, right? As a neurologist, I'm sure he would know what he's talking about. And during this time, however, his consciousness, his mind, was aware and active. And the doctor admits that he previously dismissed such accounts because he was convinced that the physical was all that there was. He didn't believe in the mind, only the brain. But he had to abandon that view when his own experience provided counter evidence. There was no physical explanation for how he could have had conscious experiences when his brain was shut down. Now, I didn't go into detail into his story, but the other accounts that I've read is that I'm not talking about visions of an angel or visions of God or visions of whatever. I'm talking about they were outside of their body while they were lying in the hospital and were describing things that were going on when they regained consciousness that they would not have known, if they had been in a coma or if they had actually been under or those kind of things. And there's actually two guys, Gary Habermas, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's quite a famous apologist, especially in the area of resurrection. He's written a lot of books, got his PhD in history and philosophy of religion. And J.P. Moreland, also quite a prominent Christian philosopher. They wrote this book, Beyond Death, Exploring the Evidence for Immortality. So they basically collected a whole lot of information about people's near-death experiences, and I think they sifted through the dodgy ones and then the ones that they, had a good explanation. And I just want to show you this clip quickly. It's an interview with Gary Habermas, but it's not the whole interview, but he's just speaking about two near-death experiences that just can't be explained away. So, sorry, I just need to get it across here.
She has a near. This woman has she's being operated on. She has a near-death experience. She's up above her body. She's looking down. She's watching herself. And sometimes they don't even know it's them because they identify with who's up by the ceiling. That's their point of consciousness. And on the top of this medical device that was in the room, hospitals often rivet numbers like offices do to keep track of typewriters and to keep track of things. She looked down and there was a 12-digit number riveted onto the top of this medical thing. And she said, I'm OCD. And so I memorized the 12-digit number. As soon as she comes to, she says to the nurse, write this down. Now, I'm not saying this is a number, but it's like, write this down, 67521 600. 12 numbers. And the nurse wrote it down. And they were later moving the apparatus out of the room. And the nurse jumps in and says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Let me get my sheet out. Wow, the number's exactly right. Now she sees that in a state, and many of these people, when you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, this particular species of cardiac arrest, you have no measurable heart waves, and within an average of 15 seconds, you have no brain waves. So if she was out of her body for as long as 5 minutes, she theoretically has no heart or brain waves. How does she know? How does she know to repeat that data? How does she know what's up there? So that's one well evidence one. Boy, people ask me, they'll say, well, I'll say, what kind of evidence do you want? I'll give you another one is a real fast one. A guy had surgery. He was up above his body watching the doctors do this, but he got maybe a little bored. I don't know. He started drifting a little bit, looking around. He went through a wall into the next surgical ward, and he watched a guy having his leg amputated. So he gives an explanation of what happens in the room with the leg amputation because I saw it. But you're on that bed. Yeah, but I'm telling you, I saw it. How do you know? Here's some explanation. I'm making up what he might have said, but he could have said, well, all the nurses in the room had white uniforms on, except for this one. She had a pale green uniform on. I mean, something like that. Or these are actual cases. In one, a person dropped a beaker on the floor and it broke, and the person watched it. Or in another one, a woman's pin fell off her dress, and a doctor stepped on it. And the near-death person said, I know who lost the pen, and I can name the doctor who stepped on it because I saw it. So these are data, and many times in the absence of heart and brain, any kind of activity, measurable. And so it seems like we're talking about, here's the point, we're talking about consciousness beyond the initial death of heart and brain. Now it's near death because the person comes back from it, but during those minutes while they're out, it's highly evidential.
So that's just two accounts that he proposes, and I realize that there are a lot of tough questions that arise, when you watch something like that, or when you hear about these kind of experiences. But I think that there's something that we can learn and something that we can't learn from these experiences. And at the very least, we can learn that there is more to this world than simply the physical. At the very least, that's what we can learn. What people learn during these experiences, they vary so much that perhaps we can't know if what they learn is true or not. So if they talk about meeting God and what it's like, or going to heaven, or whatever that is, it varies so much that it's difficult to know what is true or what is not. So, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the experience actually happened, because there is no other explanation for things like that. I'm not talking about maybe the hallucinations or the occult stuff or whatever, but I'm talking about explanations like that. And we can conclude that there is evidence of an afterlife from these reports, but maybe we don't know exactly what the nature of that is. And for that, we have to return again to the evidence for religious claims that we all have access to in this life. And so, yes, we're back to evidence for God, Jesus, and the resurrection, and the reliability of the Bible. So is the spiritual realm real? Yes. And I think we can say yes with confidence because we have good reasons to believe that God exists. We have good reasons to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And we have good reasons to believe that the Bible is true and accurate, and it teaches about the spiritual realm. It teaches about things that are beyond nature. or God who is beyond nature. Thanks. So maybe we can just go into a time of Q and hold the A. No, I'm just kidding. We could try have some Q&A questions. Yes.
Could you describe what the world would look like if there were no supernatural component?
Sure. Okay. I'm not sure if I could describe what the world would look like. I know, so for example, someone like Richard Dawkins, who doesn't believe in God, he only believes in the physical, says that at the end there is no, it's just a pitiless indifference, the world. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no right, there's no wrong. That's his view. If the world is just made up of chemicals and physics and whatever, that's how he thinks it would look like. But my question would be, but is that really how we live? You know, does he really live that to its logical conclusion? If we all just walked around, well, what's the point? There's no point in anything.
I suppose that he's making that claim based on some logical reasoning, which must, if you take his philosophy as being correct, must be testable at the atomic level. There must be some atoms that explain that. And so whether if somebody has a different opinion, maybe they've got different atoms, but there could be no concordance between their views or reason to believe that a view could be debated. And if consciousness was a property of atoms, wouldn't a black hole be much more conscious than a human being?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's difficult to say if there wasn't a spiritual realm, that why would a lump of rock not be the same as a human being?
yeah. And I, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, you know, we don't really know because, yeah, I mean, we believe that there is a spiritual realm or the supernatural. But I think you're right. If you take that to the logical conclusion, if all we are is just physics, you know, just accidents happening over however long a time period, it just doesn't make sense where things like consciousness comes from, where things like our morality comes from. Why has it developed in us and not in other animals, for example? Like, you know, I don't know if the lions sit around and talk about truth, you know. Oh, there goes a gazelle. Oh no, I think that's actually a zebra. You know, I don't think they sit around having those kind of discussions. So why? And yeah, I don't know. Those questions need to be answered from the other side as well. And I don't think they know. You know, when we talk about the origin of the universe and the origin of life, I think those are two big questions that still have not been figured out, as far as I understand. As I said, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know exactly. But as far as I understand, those are two big questions, and those are two major questions that science still hasn't explained, how non-life made life.
Can we not look at it from a dimensional point of view? The reality versus non-reality, or the human versus the spiritual, like 3D versus no D.
Okay.
What I'm saying.
Yeah.
But we've got to be able to spiritually transcend because it's there. It says so. That's what Jesus did.
What do you mean by spiritually transcend?
We're going to move from a physical sense into the spiritual sense when we die.
Well, we get resurrected bodies, but I mean, Jesus' body, his resurrected body it was different, but it was, he could eat, he could speak, he could do whatever, so it was almost glorified.
But then he left.
Yeah.
So what replaced him? Spiritual, the Holy Spirit.
No, I don't think it replaced him. I mean, the Holy Spirit is a different person.
I understand it. But what I'm talking about is in reference to us being here. And then who do we seek guidance with to a large extent? So when two or more are gathered, who's with us? Holy Spirit is with us.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about. That's that different dimension.
Yeah, I would maybe, I would just say it's another aspect of reality. So I don't think we live in this reality and then there's a different reality elsewhere, the spiritual reality. I think they're part of God's creation. They're part of God, what God created. We just experience this right now because this is where we are. So I don't know if it's a different dimension. I don't know if I'm understanding your definition of dimension properly, but I would, because for me that it sounds like a different thing altogether. Whereas what I'm saying is I think that the spiritual realm is an aspect of this of our reality. So we have the physical and then the spiritual, but God created it all. So God is actually the one outside of the natural, which is I would include because He created demons and angels and all those things. I don't know. Am I understanding your question correctly?
Can I ask, which might change the topic, but also might help? How do we access the spiritual? How do we? I mean, a lot of us we're very secular, aren't we? We don't. We live as if the senses are what you live by.
Mm.
Whereas I recognize that 2,000 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, the spiritual was much more part of their lives. And I think if you go into a township or rural part of South Africa where kind of ancestral worship is big, they have a very strong sense of the spiritual, whereas we don't really.
Sure.
How do we
Access it.
How do we get to know the spiritual? I mean, if you're right, and I think you are right, that the spiritual is here, we just can't see it.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when Jesus returns, then we will see it. That's what the point
So,
of the spiritual is.
from a biblical point of view, should we be accessing it?
Why not?
Well, isn't that what we do when we pray?
Yeah, but I'm just trying to ask the question that when you say the spiritual, what do you mean by that? Do you want to talk to angels? Do you want to?
You can play those games and things like that. No.
Yeah.
How do I live in
Do
the
you
light
want-
of the fact that we are spiritual beings?
Sure. It's a good question, and I think you're right. Like I think in our, Western mentality, we have lost a lot of that that aspect of reality because if you go into different cultures, the spiritual is still very real for them. But I think it goes back to the philosophies that we've bought into, that only the physical is real and those kind of things that have just been progressed throughout the. But maybe one aspect is, you mentioned it yourself, praying. Praying is a part of what we should be doing as Christians. And I don't know, maybe another aspect is like actually growing and learning in who God is. So are we reading our Bibles enough, which actually give us the information that we need? Are we studying them properly, or is all we listen to is a Sunday sermon and then, we good to go? But, because then it brings up maybe the aspect of spiritual warfare as well, which yeah, is, yeah,
Because my atheist friends or secular friends would say, if you do that, you're going backwards. That's what the world was like
yeah,
before we became clever. We're going backwards. But in a sense, I think that where we've got to now is we're stuck. And to go forward, we need to live in the light of a bigger reality, which is a spiritual reality, because the secular reality is not real. It's not, doesn't explain everything. It doesn't answer all the questions, and it doesn't bring joy and satisfaction to your life, or improve the world.
and yeah, Kent?
But I was just thinking how, like, the biblical story begins with sort of heaven and earth being one in some ways, that the spiritual and physical is not ripped apart like we tend to do so often in our thinking. That physical stuff is the real, and the spiritual is drifting out there somewhere. That story of the Bible seems to be these two things are supposed to be kept together, the spiritual and the physical. Like your body is the spiritual thing right now. The question, I don't know, Reg, can you imagine a world without the spiritual? No, of course not, because it's actually all God's Spirit sustaining it. And I think we've lost that to the sciences, that actually these are laws. They just operate according to themselves. Well, who operates the laws? Where do they come from? Who sustains gravity? So all these things that we've discovered actually, I think, are deeply spiritual in and of themselves, that the physical and the spiritual are supposed to be kept together. By the time you get to Revelation, you see heaven and earth becoming one. It's actually this joining of flesh and spirit.
Yeah,
And the early heresies for the church were when people split apart and they sort of said, there's a special spiritual knowledge for the Christian, the Gnostics, they were called. And I wonder if that's kind of what we do today. We sort of lost the sense of the Holy Spirit in all things, and in physical things. We've just become so secularly minded. And I think somehow to restore the wonder of that, when you look at creation and the thunder, and you just go, oh, that's convection and the air going and building, and then it rains, and the hail, and it goes in the system, and the hail ruins your car. Sorry.
You got to-
So just in a sense, yeah, trying to really see God in everything around us, because it isn't just separate from Him. It's His
Yeah.
creation. It's His precious thing. He's currently right now sustaining it. And somehow
'Cause-
trying to bring the worlds together a bit more would help us, not just sort of that's natural, that's supernatural. Like actually, this world is supernatural. It's incredible. Or other things in nature. Yeah.
yeah. That,
Like when we understand it now, we strip it of its spiritual nature. We just say we've got it in a box now. We know the weather system. But actually, you can step back with that knowledge and say, how incredible is that? That operates like this, and the rain cycle.
yeah. And I mean, just because we can explain it doesn't take away the fact that God made it that way, you know, and how incredible it is. And I mean, I don't know what Rates exactly said, but I mean, when you look at the design in some of the stuff in the world, I mean, it's just incredible. But I think I'll just maybe going back to the point you guys were making, or the question, is that I think that when we talk about the spiritual and the supernatural, I think there's a confusion in what we actually mean by it. So when the guys are using the sangomas to make a love potion to make someone fall in love with them, they feel that is the spirit, contacting the spiritual realm or using the supernatural, whatever. And I think we need to be careful that we don't become superstitious as Christians, to do certain things, or we've got to say certain things so that Jesus or God will bless us in a certain way, or whatever it is. So when we talk about the spiritual and the supernatural, and how do we connect with that, is it not just being a better follower of Christ? Because have we not received the Holy Spirit already? Why? We don't need to connect with it. We need to grow in Him. Acknowledge and as I said, like learn and grow. And it's not necessarily about maybe doing certain things or saying certain things or reading certain portions of Scripture and, those kind of things to connect with the spiritual. It's maybe just, being a better follower of Christ. And, when I read the New Testament, the major concerns or the major things was how to live your life as a Christian. How do you go forward? Now you've accepted Christ, so now Paul writes to all the churches and whatever on various topics. How do you live your life going forward? How do we be the light in the world? How do we share the gospel and all these kind of things? And maybe that is our connection to the spiritual. And are we really doing that, every day, every minute of every day? And I think some of the problems are we've separated, used the secular and the spiritual. So, we separate our lives. So we come to church on a Sunday and we sing and we listen and we read and we do whatever, but that kind of, does that follow through to the rest of the week? Maybe Monday, Tuesday, we lose it a bit. We go back to work and, things are hectic and we don't even think about it much. And then Wednesday, maybe you go to a Bible study or whatever, and then you kind of, okay, let's think about it some more. But are we really living this stuff through every day, through the decisions we make, through the career choices, through how we're raising our kids, through through everything? Are we really living that stuff? And that, yeah,
Perhaps to talk to David's question, how do we access the spiritual? I think one of our problems in our modern world is that we think that we're kind of thinking formally. Okay, if we pray, then God is with
yeah,
us, and we carry on. But David taught us, if you want to pray, you must pray until you pray. In other words, you can't just say, oh, I've got 10 minutes here, I'm going to pray, and now pray. You want to connect with God, you've got to spend time with God. There's a very good book called Jesus Continues, and he encourages us to spend time in prayer, asking for the Holy Spirit to give us guidance in one or other way, or particularly in giving some kind of message of support or encouragement for one of the members of the body. And we did that. And I had a most remarkable experience. I haven't done it much since, but that's because it's my fault. But I believe that if we spent more time in prayer and we ask God's Holy Spirit to guide us, we will be guided. We will access the guidance of the Spirit. But I think it takes time, and we don't do that.
yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. We want everything to come easy. Everything needs to be neatly packaged, So we tick the boxes and,
I have two answers for David. One is prayer. I had a great example of it 3 days ago. There came a time when my shoulder was so bad I couldn't lift a cup to my mouth.
Sure.
I was wondering, how on earth am I going to wash my hair in the shower? Well, I did it very easily. So prayer clearly is one way of accessing the spiritual. The other is surely the fact that we can reproduce human life is spiritual. And we all know how we access that. And so the separating of spiritual and physical, really physical, is wrong.
Yeah.
You're going to have to ask that question because it was a good one.
Oh, look at that. We run out of time. Sorry.
Now, I was wondering, is there a sinister ploy, read the devil, in trying to dislocate us from our spiritual walk?
I think absolutely. I think the more he can deceive us in thinking there's not a spiritual world, obviously the more we're not going to seek God. We're not going to look for God. And I think you can see that in our Western world. I mean, you look across Europe, you look at even places like the States and things like that. I think you can definitely see that. And the interesting thing is, I was talking to someone from AE the other day, and they were saying that Africa is going to be the sending continent of missionaries and stuff like that now. And I mean, okay, we maybe have a Western mindset set, but a lot of Africa doesn't. And they're the ones who are embracing the gospel. And I think you're 100% right with that. And even if I think of China, as atheist as they want them to be, there's still a lot of connection with their history, with their culture, and that is not atheistic at all. And so they still are asking questions on, God and Christianity and wanting to know more. And, people who become Christians are just so hungry for it, I mean, and I'm sure you've all heard the stories of the pastors going to train and teach, and, they just want to do 1 or 2 hours, and then they're tired and they want to rest. And the guys are like, we've traveled here for 2 days by foot, barefoot in the snow or whatever it is, and cramped in this room, and they just want to learn more and more. And I definitely think that the deception of our view of the world has a huge impact to play.
Would you say that in the non-denominational churches where there's the falling over and slaying in the spirit and that, would you say that that is helpful?
Okay, so I'll give you my personal opinion on that. And just because you are, okay, so let me just back up a little bit. I grew up in a very charismatic church, and we did that often. I saw that every Sunday. I myself went through that whole thing, and I don't believe that is real. I'm not saying all of it is not real, but I think that a lot of it is driven by ulterior motives. And I don't think that falling down on the floor is an indication of your contact with the spiritual, in a sense. Now, people may want to disagree with me. That's fine. That's my experience. And I remember being in a conference in Taiwan, thousands of people, and it was a very charismatic conference. And people were, going around, and they were blowing on each other, and they were falling over and laughing, and I was extremely uncomfortable with the whole situation, extremely. And like the guy came near to me, and I was just praying, Lord, please don't let him come near to me, because I don't know what I'm going to do to him if he blows in my face. And interestingly enough, another guy came, and he didn't do anything funny. He just sat down and was like, where you guys from, whatever. They could obviously tell we weren't Taiwanese. And he just said, can I pray for you? And then that was a completely different experience. But I think that there's a lot of danger in that, personally.
Can I just share a different experience?
Yeah.
Just by contrast. So I grew up the exact opposite. Very conservative, very unspiritual church environment. But there was a time about 10 years ago when one of the members of my church was really, really sick and she just wasn't getting better. And it wasn't desperately, she was just down and it wasn't great. And I remember one Sunday night arriving at church and saying to her, I saw her there and I said, we're going to pray for you tonight. Now that's not in my nature to do that kind of thing, but I really just felt someone said to me, pray for her. So at the end of the service, we do that. So everybody's gone except for a couple of elders and me, and I stand behind her and I put my hand on her head and I prayed for her with oil and I prayed. She's sitting in a pew like this. I'm behind her with my hand on her and I'm feeling her going down. And I'm thinking, I'm not pushing her, but let's make sure I'm not pushing her. And I put my hand up because I didn't want to be accused of pushing her. And down she went. And it was quite interesting because in a very controlled way, she just put herself to lie on the pew. She didn't fall over, she just lay down there. And the next thing she was well. So, like your experience of healing. So, and it's interesting, I've never repeated it. And I have prayed for other people since then, but it was just an amazing experience for me of God answering prayers, which is stuck in my experience. So I agree. I've been to services like that and it's left me cold, but I have experienced somebody fall over and be healed as well. So I don't think you can rule it out entirely, but unfortunately there are a lot of fakes, aren't there? And you have to be able to discern the difference, and that's not always so easy.
Yeah, that's true. It is.
And I mean, if we look at, even when you think about the Trinity itself, the Father and the Son, and the one who gets very little attention, maybe in other ways too much on the other side, is the Holy Spirit. When we think about being disconnected from spiritual things, we actually in some ways, I think at times, disconnected from the Spirit, not just spiritual things. But yeah, as you were saying earlier, John, the Holy Spirit in our life. I've just been reading through Galatians, and again our Paul just said, walk by the Spirit. It's like who you are. You believe in Jesus, you're filled with the Spirit. And he doesn't explain what that looks like.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're like, oh, Paul, why you didn't have a chapter on like, I mean, there's the fruit of the Spirit, which is your character, but there's no like cheat sheet about, this is how you get filled with the Spirit, this is how but it's just the most wonderful thing. This is who you are as a Christian. You believe in the cross of Christ and you are filled with the Spirit. You walk in that Spirit. And there's an adventure in that I think these tensions bring out. As you're saying, there's some experiences where that gets perhaps abused, and there's some things that are like that, just a wonderful encounter with the Spirit. Could you manufacture that again? No, of course not.
Yeah.
Trying to be
But
open to that, but guarded at the same time. Just say, comfortable.
And it's just, and what has amazed me over my Christian life is, and it's just like when I think about some stuff that happened and people that God has used, is I just think that God is so much bigger than what than what we think He is, and He can use whatever situation He wants to fulfill His will, and even if there are these crazy people running around blowing in each other's faces and whatever, he may use that, he may not. It's, but he is so much bigger than what we think he is. So yeah.
Just for a little bit more of a younger point of view, I am very skeptical about a lot of stuff like this. And I've been to churches or youth groups, where they've had a worship evening, and people have been crying and in tears and sitting down, and half the people are praying for other people while the songs are going on. And I often feel very skeptical about that. I'm like,
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That is, it's very difficult. I don't know how you would deal with that. I know that our our Christianity, or some forms of Christianity, have been very experience driven. So, you know, play the music in the background while the guy is praying, and get emotionally stirred up so that you can have an experience. My biggest problem with that is that if we only rely on our experiences, and I'm not saying those experiences are not real, like David just shared with us. I'm not saying those are not real, but if we only rely on those experiences, what happens when those experiences are taken away? And that's my biggest concern for young people, especially, is that the foundation that we are giving them when we send them off into the world, I think are you going to university next year? Okay, so when you go to university one day, have we, as the church as a whole, given you a good enough foundation to be able to stand firm when things like your atheist professor telling you that you're an absolute idiot for believing in God and he'll show you why, kind of thing, have we given you the firm foundation to stand firm on? Because experience is great, and we can have these wonderful experiences, and whatever, but what happens when those are taken away, or you go through an experience that is not pleasant? Last year I was involved in a very serious motorbike accident, and I nearly lost my life. And lying in hospital for 5 weeks was not pleasant. I was in a wheelchair for a couple of months, learning to walk again. All that kind of stuff is not pleasant. And if I base my Christianity on my experiences, then where would that have left me? And I think, I don't know how you deal with that with young people, because I think that a lot of people like that. They like you see the churches that grow in youth groups is the ones with the nice bands and the fog machine and the all the pizza and the lemon twist and whatever, and yeah, I just worry that we're not building a firm foundation, and yeah, how you deal with that with your own peers, I wouldn't even begin to try and understand. But maybe, I don't know how well are they just like various gatherings that you've been to, or are they your friends?
A lot of there's a church in Hilton actually that I've been to the youth group and discussed with, and I basically decided I'm not going to it based on this thing. And a lot of my friends have decided they wanted to go there, partly because it's a big youth group and it's got a lot of people going, and just because of the way it is, because it's all very emotionally based and experience based. And I don't like that, so I don't go. But I can't just say to them, don't go to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know
But
what to do.
yeah.
They do have devotionals and they do have places where they look in the Word, but not in the sense that our youth group does. And our youth group is small because we don't have worship, for example.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's very hard because we go. I also go to summer camp every year, and that is a lot of it is emotional and a lot of it is worship based, and I think it's awesome. But at the same time, you've got to have good teaching, and it's really hard to get that to my peers. That you can't just live on your emotion. You can't just
Yeah.
live on your experience, because they'd rather go to the youth group where everyone is experiencing stuff left, right, and center.
Maybe, I don't know if this would work or not, but like maybe one of the ways to do it is invite a few friends and say, look, let's talk about why we believe. Let's go through some reasons about why, and start off with, why are you a Christian? Now, I often ask that question to high school students, university students, church people, and the overwhelming response is because I grew up that way, or because I attended church, or because my parents are Christian. And it's, yeah, those may be factors in you becoming a Christian, but if that is your only reason, there's going to be problems down the line. And so maybe, start exploring with them reasons why they believe, and then work in that, emotions are great, but our emotions also change every 5 seconds. So, that's not great to base our relationship with Christ on. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's a very difficult question. And one I often myself struggle with, because, dealing with young people, when you start talking more about like why you believe, I don't have 500, young people standing outside waiting to hear the wisdom that I have to share, So it's a question I often struggle with as well. Like how do we actually gain that balance?
So I think just in my experience as well, I would say that we can't really say what they are doing is necessarily wrong and make that judgment. I think it's really dangerous to be doing that. To me, I mean, we might be missing something that they have, and that might be really powerful for those people and what they're experiencing and where it leads them in the future. You know, I think we would be discounting what God can do if we just said that's wrong, not right. But I think we have a different experience which we can share with them, like you're saying. And the Anglicans have a different experience which they can share with us. And I think we are wrong in as many other ways. So I just think we can share our experience and our knowledge, and your teachings with them. And I think that's a good place to start and a humble place to start.
Yeah, I think we need to let people go if they want to, but we can keep discussing if we want to as well. I think my answer to that would be there is a difference between emotional and spiritual. They're not totally separate, but they're not always the same. And I think sometimes we equate rational with spiritual, and other times we equate emotional with spiritual, and we kind of separate ourselves off. Whereas actually they're not all exactly the same. And so yeah, if you try to just build it on emotion, build your spiritual relationship with God on your emotional experience, I think you're selling yourself short. But if you're just doing it rationally, you're also selling yourself short, because we are holistic people. And part of that holism is that we are spiritual. And we need to live in the light of that. So this is a difficult subject, and it's difficult for us Westerners to talk about this. But it's good to do that. So thank you for giving it a bash. We really appreciate that. And we valued listening, and we valued talking it through. And thank you.
Pleasure.
We really,
Thank you for having me.
do appreciate it. And I think it would be really appropriate to finish with a prayer. Let's engage in the spiritual realm and talk to God. And Ken, seeing you had such